Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Land Management Scale Approaches session of our SWEEP Expo. Just before we get going with this session, there's just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd just like to run through with everybody. Firstly, this is a meeting session on Zoom, so could everybody just keep their videos and their microphones off whenever they're not speaking, please? Secondly, we do have a Q&A session associated with each of the presentations today. So if you have any questions, please could you just hold this, and then when we're in a Q&A session, if you could just raise your hand virtually. To do that, if you look at the participants panel, there should be an option for you to raise your hand, and we'll see that and we'll come to you for a question then. So if you would like to discuss any topics or you need any technical help, there's also a chat option for everybody in the Zoom meeting. So just at the bottom of the screen here, there's a little chat button, and if you click that, you can either speak to everybody or you can access the sort of technical support as well. And finally, you might find it helpful to hide any non-video participants. So if you right-click anyone who's sharing video, it gives you that option. And as there's quite a few of us in this session, that might just help your computer automatically focus on anybody who's asking a question. So I think we will commence in that case. So without further ado, to start with, our first presentation is on exploring business-led solutions to the pollinator decline problem, and it's by Grace Twiston-Davies from SWEEP, Houston Orbin from the Cornwall AONB, and Alistair Moore from the Lost Gardens of Heligan.
Hello, thank you for that. Yeah, so my name's Grace and I'm an Impact Fellow on SWEEP. I'm just sharing some work that I've been doing in collaboration with the TEBI project on testing business-led solutions to the pollinator decline problem, but on a regional scale. So today I'm joined by Hugh, one of our co-authors, and Alistair, who's the Estates and Gardens Manager from the Lost Gardens of Heligan, and one of the key businesses in our case study in the report that and you'll hear from them shortly. So I've put my email up here, so if anyone does want to email me with any questions that might pop up, if they don't get a chance to do that in the Q&A session, then please do. And we do have our sort of extended Q&A at the end of this session as well. So I've just popped that there. If, yeah, and I might pop it in the chat later as well. So SWEEP collaborated with the TEBI project, which aims to create both economic and environmental growth in Cornwall and the Scilly. And we created a challenge network to bring businesses together to explore emerging markets around local wildflower seed, products and services to find solutions to the main driver of pollinator declines, which is habitat loss. So this network was designed as a regional multi-stakeholder initiative, which launched early last year to facilitate business-led solutions to mitigate against the main causes of pollinator decline, but to also contribute towards Cornwall's environmental growth strategy and the UK's national pollinator strategy. So he was going to talk a little bit more about multi-stakeholder initiatives, but just as an overview, they're basically collaborations of corporations, civil society, other organisations, governments and communities, all coming together to address a key challenge like pollinator declines or climate change or water quality. So this sort of approach basically is like places Cornwall and the Scilly within the front runners of an increasingly international drive to integrate economic and environmental growth. So it's a great test bed. And we created this white paper report for businesses, policymakers, other interested parties, which can be downloaded using a link that I will pop in the chat once I've done my little section, so you can click on that and download the report for yourself. So as well as Hugh and I, our other co-authors, Faye Kahani and Professor Stefano Pasquicci aren't able to join us today, but they have created some really nice summary videos and an introduction to the pollinator decline problem, which I'll pop in the chat so you can have a look at that maybe after the session and get a bit more information. So this report basically summarises our current scientific knowledge of pollinator declines, the overall business response to the problem and the increasing role of multi-stakeholder initiatives in facilitating an appropriate and coordinated approach. But also some case studies of the businesses involved in the Challenge Network, which we use then to inform our 8 key recommendations for business and policy to find these local solutions to a global problem. So just as a little sort of overview, so pollinators provide critical environmental, economic and social services. They maintain biodiversity for a healthy environment. They provide services worth billions to the global economy, and they keep our human population healthy by pollinating nutrient-rich crops. But however, there is international scientific consensus that wild pollinators are in decline. And the main cause of these declines is the loss of high-quality flower-rich habitats, followed by pesticide use, climate change, invasive species and disease. So these causes, they're complex, and they also combine and interact, which means that finding solutions is often extremely complex, especially if it's being tackled by just one sector alone. And a main problem can be that there can be trade-offs between and conflicts between solutions that might be solve the problem ecologically, economically, and politically. So what's good ecologically might not be good economically or politically. So this means that tackling the pollinator decline problem requires an integrated approach across these sectors, and businesses can play a key part of the solution. So a multi-stakeholder initiative like this Challenge Network that we ran last year can be an effective approach at implementing solutions to environmental challenges at this regional scale. So together with stakeholders from science, conservation and policy, with 38 small to medium-sized enterprises in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, we co-designed a series of workshops, events, and also one-to-one business development mentoring to find solutions to the pollinator decline problem with these businesses. So as well as this sort of series of events, we also created 22 bespoke pollinator management reports to help these businesses support local pollinator populations. And also many of those businesses received desk-based ecological surveys from Cornwall Wildlife Trust as part of the TEDI Business Assist programme. And together through this process, we came up with our 8 key recommendations. These recommendations are listed in the report, but I'll just go through these now. So the first one is about seizing environmental growth as an entrepreneurial opportunity. So actually finding solutions is an innovation opportunity, not just a sort of a greenwashing or a corporate social responsibility opportunity. It's actually a business opportunity. As well as that, one of our key recommendations were to utilise and expand mechanisms for sharing knowledge, skills and equipment, and especially across sectors, because sectors don't often share the same sort of networks. So it's really important to actually have a cross-sectoral sharing of these skills. Of course, one of our recommendations was to instigate multi-stakeholder initiatives, and Hugh will provide us a bit more information on that shortly. Another recommendation was that it's really important to create dialogue and transparency within the supply chain and to be able to understand the impacts across this chain, especially for raw materials. So what was quite interesting from the science that we put into our report was that actually the loss of pollinators could have huge supply chain shocks across the whole supply chain, not just about food production. It could affect raw materials like timber, like fabric materials like cotton, also medicine, as well as obviously food materials. A sort of a key and I guess quite obvious recommendation was that we need to develop green infrastructure for pollinators. But what was really interesting is actually there's quite new and innovative opportunities for green infrastructure. It doesn't have to be your sort of usual suspects. There's excellent opportunities. For example, in Cornwall, we've got initiatives for green spaces, community green spaces and road verges and sort of places that you might have not originally thought were sort of havens for pollinator habitat. And one of the really interesting recommendations that came out is around sort of championing and implementing evidence-based actions. So one of the key benefits of TEVI and SWEEP is that stakeholders and businesses have this direct link to academics. So actually they can have that cutting edge information to help them with their business, and it gives them a unique selling point that they're able to utilize that. Rather obviously, we've got seeking to minimise the use of harmful agricultural chemicals through sustainable land use. That sort of goes without saying, but it does obviously have its challenges and its conflicts against that. And finally, one of our key recommendations was to continue raising awareness for the public, customers, and other businesses. But actually, businesses can be an exemplar for other businesses, and they can. So it's not just about your marketing strategy. It's actually about really sharing the key values of those businesses and acting as an example to other businesses on how to sort of approach such a challenge. So we now have the challenge of embedding and scaling up this multi-stakeholder approach and the recommendations that we've developed together. So I'm going to hand over to Hugh, who's going to describe a little bit about business best practice and the importance of multi-stakeholder initiatives in more detail.
Hi everyone, thanks Grace. I'm Hugh and I'm a sustainability and CSR manager. For the last 3 years I've been working for a family business making reductions in energy, water, oil and gas and recycling across 3 tourism and hospitality businesses in Cornwall. And I'm also a sustainability research consultant, and I've been working on the white paper with Grace. Today I'm going to be particularly talking about how businesses have been approaching pollinator decline and contextualizing that their actions within the scientific analysis. And then I'm going to talk about multi-stakeholder initiatives as a vehicle for more effective action. So negative changes to ecosystems and the resulting decline of pollinators poses both opportunities and challenges to businesses. Opportunities can be engagement with customers, increasing brand trust, improving commercial resilience, and building competitive advantage. Risks are non-compliance with legislation, losing investment, being left behind in the market, and threatened by supply chain instability. And for this report, I analysed 20 international and 7 national UK companies' actions to reduce the decline of pollinators. And from that, we extracted 5 themes of what could be thought of as best practice in approaching pollinator declines. And just to summarise, they were creating dialogue with suppliers, developing habitats for pollinators, championing research into honeybee health, seeking to minimise the use of harmful agricultural chemicals, and raising awareness with the public. Some of the companies that are doing this really well included Jordan Cereal in the UK, who use 5% of their farmed land to provide year-round habitats for food, nest sites, and shelter for wild pollinators. And the luxury goods company LVMH have launched a bee school, which is an educational program to raise awareness among school children. As well as what's being thought of as best practice, there's also 2 issues identified with how business as a whole is trying to tackle this issue. And the first one is that most of the actions that are described are cited within wide-ranging CSR strategies, and they're not at the moment subject to external reporting. And actions should be evaluated continuously, and robust data management is required to really measure how effective businesses' actions are. So a question that would be helpful to be asked for annual reports is this a CSR issue, or is this starting to become part of wider business strategies? And the second issue was that only a fraction of the businesses and industries affected by pollinator decline are recognising there is a problem. And those that do focus on measures specific to their industries. And the problem has become so complex that single actions can be harmful as well as helpful without a wider coordination. So to summarize the sample of best practice highlighted here, it could be made more effective through collaboration and coordination across different businesses and sectors, with actions continuously evaluated and improved through reporting. Which brings me on to multi-stakeholder initiatives. Pollinator decline can be defined as a wicked problem, which means it's hard to define and coordinated action is needed across stakeholders, often with conflicting values. And multi-stakeholder initiatives, or MSIs, are collaborative networks of organizations and individual cross-sectors that come together to find solutions to complex problems. And they often are comprised of government, business sectors, civilians, academia, and NGOs, who will gather together to have a discussion around what's best practice, how to develop new knowledge, start using collective intelligence to solve problems. And traditionally, they then will develop policy and/or standardization for stakeholders to sign up to, which gives a legitimacy of purpose and frames messages and actions in understandable ways. And just to give an idea of how influential MSIs are at the moment, a report from MSI Integrity gave the following data. There are 45 transnational standard-setting MSIs that operate in 170 countries, working with 50 national governments with 9,000 companies regulated, including 65 global Fortune 500 companies with combined annual revenues in excess of $5.4 trillion. And almost 90% of the industry-specific MSIs are in either agriculture, mining, energy, or consumer goods. And an example of a sustainability-focused MSI is the Forest Stewardship Council, which run a governance structure based on participation, democracy, equality, and transparency. And the members govern the council and are drawn from all of the different stakeholders. And there's now a global strategy containing key goals that everyone has signed up to. And TEVI has really started operating at the leading edge of MSI practice, moving away from policy setting and standardization to reduce environmental impacts, to working with businesses to improve the value offer of their products and services so that they actually benefit the environment. They don't just mitigate against the harmful impacts. And as well as that, TEVI also facilitate business-to-business collaboration, which enables a coordinated approach to addressing specific environmental problems. And other MSIs that work in this way are Palu Paru, Agroecological Symbiosis, which is a network of several organic producers and processors, millers, bakers, farmland, transportation, retailers, and a biomass plant for a completely environmentally friendly agricultural process and product. And Blue City, which is in Rotterdam, accelerates over 30 circular economy entrepreneurs through offering office space and a disused swimming pool. And these multi-stakeholder initiatives are working with SMEs, which are more agile and able to iterate ideas quickly, prototype, and are starting to find solutions to very complicated environmental issues, which hopefully more established multi-stakeholder initiatives can then adopt in the future. And I'm handing over to Alistair, who's going to be presenting a case study.
Hello everyone, and once again, my name's Alistair Moore. I am the manager of Gardens and Estate at the Lost Gardens of Heligan, and I've been in the very happy situation of working with Grace and Tevi on a really interesting and very beautiful project, which was bringing alive a 11.5 acre piece of ground at the Lost Gardens with annual wildflowers. The breakdown of, oh, there we are, isn't that lovely? As you can see below that unfortunate picture of me is a sort of breakdown of 4 points: so creating dialogue in the supply chain, developing habitats for pollinators, championing research and raising awareness with the public. All of those elements are contained in what we did, and I'll very briefly give you an overview of what we did, which illustrates those points. Grace and I started off with the concept of just creating habitats for pollinators and then addressing the issues of how this would stack up in terms of a business case. So looking at the picture you see before you is this field, Valentine's. The starting point for me was, who can I collaborate with to make this happen? And in terms of championing research, SWEEP and Bee Steward and the Bumblebee Conservation Trust all contributed to developing a baseline of research from which we could move forward. In terms of developing the field itself, we worked very closely with the National Wildflower Centre, who are based out of the Eden Project. And they were immediately interested, not just in the fact that we could potentially be creating a crop for them, but also a crop with Cornish provenance. And they have a number of projects within Cornwall, especially around St Austell, which revolve around the sowing of wildflower seeds and hence the support of pollinators. So with them, we prepared the ground. Where the business side for Heligan comes in is in terms of the public. Obviously, we're not a farm. We are there as an interactive site to encourage people to engage with the natural world and to make some money. And so in terms of the process, we went specifically for annual seed because it would be, it's a short turnover in terms of delivering a visual treat, while also being able to control when the flowering took place to a degree. So with the annual seed, it meant that we could sow later in the year, sowing in April, in order to have a big flowering in August, which is our sort of key point for our visitors. Following the flowering, we harvested the seed with a combine harvester and gathered on the first, this is our second year now, the first year we got about 270 kilos. This year, again, through better collaboration, we had a better piece of kit and we got over 600 kilos of wildflower seed. In terms of raising awareness with the public, we work closely with the Bumblebee Conservation Trust in terms of our interpretation. And as you can see from the picture, we cut a path into the wildflower field to allow people to walk through it and enjoy the intense pleasure, not just of the flowers, but also the wonderful summer buzz of pollinators. On top of that, in terms of raising public awareness, what the visual treat has provided is quite a lot of television coverage. We've been both on BBC and ITV local news. We're also engaged with filming a TV programme, Devon and Cornwall, for Channel 4. So in terms of our business approach, and that's the other balancing side of the project we're on, pollinators and business. In terms of the business side, this has obviously been fantastic PR for us, fantastic for our customers, the visitors. It's very difficult to measure other than on social media, and without question, the wildflower field, when it was in flower, was just the most broadly distributed bit of social media we had: Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But very importantly for us, for the weirdness of 2020, the wildflower seed that we could then sell to our visitors was a really important income for us. So not only were people going away with a little bit of wildflower seed to put in their own gardens, it was an important income for us. Also, the majority of the seed actually went up to Everton and Liverpool for a massive municipal wildflower slash pollinator project in those cities. So it's been a huge success for us, and I trust it will continue to be so. So in short, raising awareness, we feel that's been a great success. Developing the habitats, as you can see, during the period of flowering, it's been extraordinary. And also the byproduct of it, our population of finches has gone up considerably. And we are creating a new dialogue in the supply chain in terms of both the National Wildflower Centre. We're getting other landowners involved using our wildflower seed. And possibly the one victim of 2020 overall has been, we would have loved to have been doing more research during 2020, but it was just became quite difficult to get people on site to carry out the surveys. So in brief, that's what we did, and it was a wonderful project, and I look forward to continuing next year.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think we have time for one quick question before we move on to the next group. If you don't have an opportunity to ask a question now, then just a reminder, at 4:15 until 4:45, there will be breakout rooms with each of the presenters, so you'll have an opportunity to discuss presentations in more detail then. I've just seen that Marion Bryant has asked a question about this. Would you like to go on to webcam to ask that, please?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. Sorry, I don't have a visual. Yeah, just wanted to ask about whether there was any plans to expand the operation at Heligan. Thinking about things like we have a real shortage in Cornwall of meadow plants for recreating species-rich meadows. So I'm thinking of the biennials, the longer-lived perennials. Just wondering if there's any plans to expand into other areas.
Thanks, Marion. Yes, I think our issue initially is with our annual field is that they are annuals and they're cornfield annuals, so there's a requirement for cultivation every year in order to produce what is a crop both for us in terms of our visitors, but also the seed. I am currently in discussion with the National Wildflower Centre about how we could potentially have a perennial mix, more species rich, and potentially looking at greater carbon capture through the lack of cultivation and keeping the perennials. But at the moment, probably next year as well, we'll stick with the annuals, but absolutely. Our issue at Heligan is that we are confined by the amount of land we have. What we would love to be is an exemplar, or hopefully one of many exemplars in Cornwall about what you can do with a relatively small piece of land, both in terms of a crop, but also for biodiversity and pollinators.
Thank you. That's that's really encouraging. Really good to know. I was thinking specifically about using species-rich green hay to create new meadows, for example. So something like a hay meadow crop. If you had a very diverse area, you could potentially be a source for all sorts of different projects. So yeah, interesting to hear how that develops in future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody. So just a reminder, I've seen there's a few questions appearing in the chat now. We do have to move on, but there'll be an opportunity to, in a breakout room, to have ask any questions with this group just at the end of today's sessions at 4:15. So our next set of presenters are Dave Luscombe, Naomi Gattis and Donna Carlos, who will work at SWEEP. And they're going to be presenting on quantitative habitat mapping and integrating remote sensing methods for mapping the extent of woodland, moorlands, and key habitats. So I'll pass over now.
Hello, my name is Dr. Naomi Gattis, and today with my colleague Dr. David Luscombe, we're going to talk about quantitative habitat mapping. We're now working in an age of open access, global extent geospatial data with an increasingly fine resolutions. These data can be used for monitoring patterns and dynamics in environment, and having access to such up-to-date information can guide optimal environmental decision making. However, the highly technical workflow required to translate data and extract information about space-time dynamics from these cost-free, open source data products currently limits their use in guiding nature-based solutions. This project aims to translate cutting-edge geospatial research into a set of easy-to-use, open-source, robust and repeatable tools, which can be embedded within our partner organisations, Dartmoor National Park Authority and the UNESCO North Devon Biosphere Reserve, including the Forestry Commission. Project outputs include a baseline habitat map across the entirety of North Devon National Park, an appropriate assessment of the accuracy of that habitat map. The accuracy assessment will give probability that each 10-metre squared pixel has been correctly assigned to a habitat type. We're developing an open source cloud-based toolkit that enables a non-remote sensing specialist to map habitat types within the national park and to assess the accuracy of that habitat map. A robust and repeatable tool will enable habitat change and its uncertainty to be identified into the future. We will also map baseline woodland stocks to 1 metre squared resolution across all the North Devon Biosphere Reserve and Dartmoor National Park Authority areas, and develop an open source cloud-based toolkit to detect change in woodland stocks. As part of the project, we will upskill staff within our partner organisations to use these tools and understand their outputs to support evidence-based land management decision making. Habitat mapping. In the first column in orange are the classes we're currently working with. As you can see, these mostly correspond to the UK Habitat Classification Schemes levels 3 and 4, with the exception of blanket bog and degraded blanket bog, where we've been asked to go to level 5 due to the prevalence and importance of these habitat types within the national park. So how are we mapping these habitat types? If only life was this simple, but this simplified workflow shows that we take satellite images and photo interpreted training data, and we put these into a random forest classifier, and this produces a habitat class map. This is then taken with further validation, photo interpreted validation data, undergoes statistical analysis to produce a pixel accuracy map. We've got a short list of statistical analyses, but haven't chosen one yet, so I'm not going to talk about this further today. For our inputs, we'll be using imagery from a pair of European Space Agency satellites. Together, these satellites circle the globe every 5 days, giving us an increased chance of cloud-free day. As you might imagine, there aren't that many cloud-free days on the top of Dartmoor, but we've selected 5 cloud-free images from our baseline year 2019. So they are February, April, July, August and September. The images you can see are centred on Fernworthy Reservoir with Chagford off to the right. As you can see from the images, some habitat types are stable throughout the year, whereas others are quite variable. Where these variations are consistent year on year and across the pixels of the same habitat type, these are helpful. For example, the purple flowering of heather, the yellowy oranging of bracken, and the transition from pale straw to bright green of the purple moorgrass. Where these changes are inconsistent, such as a modified grassland might be mown or ploughed and resown, it's more challenging. Having tested different combinations of number and timing of images, we've found that the combination of early spring and midsummer provide the best and most robust classification accuracies. The graph shows the 13 bands that are measured by Sentinel-2. As you can see, it stretches from aerosols through visible and near infrared to shortwave infrared wavelengths. Each band provides different information about the ground cover. For example, reflectance in the green band tells us it's actively photosynthesizing vegetation. Similarly, low reflectance in shortwave infrared band 11 tells us that the vegetation has a high moisture content, and this information is useful when looking at some of the wet habitats within the national park. The image here is a false colour composite of near infrared red and green. This highlights the difference between the dormant millennia on top of the moor and the actively photosynthesizing vegetation of the conifers and the lowland vegetation in February. We've investigated the use of vegetation indices. These are commonly ratios of different bands used to highlight a particular feature, such as greenness or moisture. 3 have come out as particularly useful. These are green leaf index, normalized difference wetness index, and enhanced vegetation index. All these data are being combined with additional information such as elevation and peak depth, which was mapped as part of a previous project for Dartmoor National Park Authority, to form the input data for the classifier. The other input data that's required is training data. We selected random pixels from 6 landscape character types to try and ensure sufficient pixels in the less common landscapes. We've used photo interpretation to classify 4,559 training and testing pixels. These are shown on the map. And despite our sampling strategy, some classes were still underrepresented due to their small geographical extent, such as rivers and streams. So a further 341 pixels have been added for these underrepresented groups to make sure every class has a minimum of 50 pixels. Slightly delayed due to COVID restrictions, we're now visiting a random subset of these pixels to assess the accuracy of our photo interpretation. We have selected to use a random forest classifier as they're less sensitive to noise, are less likely to overfit the model, and are computationally lighter than many other options. In a decision tree, the classifier starts at the top and selects a node to minimize the probability of incorrect classification. It adds extra nodes until adding another node doesn't improve the classification. In a random forest classifier, this process is repeated in the order of 500 times, each time using a random subset of the input data and the training data. A pixel is classified based on the most common outcome from all of these 500 trees. I apologise for the slightly layering colour scheme here, but this is an example of the results we're getting. We're getting an overall user's accuracy of 67%. Some classes are more accurate. For example, arable has an accuracy of 86%. Other classes are understandably more difficult to distinguish because they share many species in common. For example, heath and intact blanket bog are getting accuracies of 50 and 57% respectively. If we look to the hundreds of square kilometres covered and consider how long this would take to do manually, then this work is a leap forward in understanding which habitats are where within the national park. If we zoom into a couple of examples now, this one's from the lowlands, and we can see the incredible level of detail possible with the tool. It's picking up the conifer and deciduous trees in the southwest corner and the bracken to the south of that in peach. It's distinguishing the modified grassland from the arable, and it's correctly identifying the farmyards as urban areas. Pleasingly, but not shown in this example, it's also differentiating acid grasslands from meadows and modified grasslands. There are some incorrect pixels, but we can look at filtering some of this out later. If we compare this to the most commonly used land cover product produced by a Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, the increased level of detail becomes more apparent. I have a second example here from the uplands. We can see it's picking up areas of acid grass, heath and bare peat covered degraded bog in green, purple and black respectively. Intact peat blanket bog in pink, flushes, fens in pale blue and the river in darker blue. Again, if we compare this to the CEH land cover map, most of the area would have been classed as bog, so the improvement in detail is more striking. The work to date has been carried out in a statistical package R, so we could query which inputs were improving or otherwise the classification accuracy. We're currently migrating the tool over to Google Earth Engine, where a user-friendly app can be created. And now I'll pass over to my colleague Dave.
Hello, my name is David Loscombe and I'm going to talk you through the second part of our project today, which looks at mapping woodland stock throughout the North Devon Biosphere Reserve and detecting changes in that stock through time. Essentially, this project component looks to utilise the rapid data acquisition from Sentinel-1 satellites in combination with LiDAR data to produce both a detailed tree, hedgerow and woodland mapping dataset and data describing how these habitats change through time. I'll now run through this baseline mapping product and then give you some examples of how we use this in combination with satellite radar data to derive a dataset showing change through time. The baseline tree, hedgerow and woodland mapping data is directly derived from LiDAR data collected by the TELUS Southwest project at a 1 metre spatial resolution. We're able to output these data as discrete raster or vector data sets across the entire extent of the North Devon Biosphere Reserve and Dartmoor National Park. Critically, each canopy component that we map retains a unique spatial reference, and over an area that we currently process this data for, this equates to around 10 million individual canopy components. Hopefully, you'll be able to see the area mapped using this technique on the image on the left-hand side of this slide. I'll now run through a couple of examples of data outputs zoomed in at a scale relevant to the management of these types of treescapes. As you can see in this image, there are various features mapped, and the key on the left describes the categorical outputs that we have produced. Key things to note are that hedgerows are predominantly mapped in blue. These are features that are less than 3 metres high, but above 1.3 metres high. Wooded habitats are mapped as light or dark green, dependent on their height, and individual trees outside of woodlands, for example, standard trees within hedgerows, are also shown as light or dark green features. You may also be able to see some small extents of purple and orange pixels, and these describe fragmented woody features below 1.3 metres high. And purple features in particular describe these small features that are also less than 10 square metres in area. Key things to note are that the output data are fairly clean and producing reliably constrained mapping across the landscape. In this second example, you can see a more complex wooded habitat or treescape. In this example, we're looking at one of the moorland boundaries on the north of Dartmoor. In the top left-hand corner of the image, you can see that this is fringing into semi-urban area, but we are also able to distinguish trees and wooded features within such areas from buildings and other land surface structures. Again, you can see hedgerow features as well as more complex extent of wooded areas, and you can also see an encroachment of woody scrub onto the open moor in the lower part of the image. You'll also notice that these encroaching features are generally smaller and fragmented. Consequently, these are mapped as purple and orange feature classes within the output data. In this final example, which actually relates to a slightly older version of the dataset, hence the slightly different colours, we can see again this data processing pipeline is producing relatively high quality data outputs across fairly complex areas of the landscape, including again moorland fringes with scrub encroachment, urban areas, and wooded areas adjacent to other complex land surface structures such as roads. So to summarise these tree, hedgerow and woodland output data, they're easily replicable as LiDAR survey data are reflown. The data processing pipeline was developed specifically for processing data over very large spatial extents and can be easily applied to other areas where sufficient data is available. Because of the way the data is derived and the individual canopy components that are mapped, we're also able to estimate carbon stocks using established allometric relationships, although I'm not discussing any of that work here today. This obviously has important implications for both carbon accounting and climate change mitigation. At the moment, these draft data can be accessed by project partners in Google Earth Engine applications that we are developing, and these have the potential to be shared far more widely in the future if that's deemed appropriate. Future work on the output data here probably will look to examine the spatial connectivity of these habitats in the southwest, and also landscape scale scenario projections of change in these areas and these habitats. So now to come on to the second part of this tree and woodland work, which is looking at change detection using Sentinel-1 radar imaging. Specifically, we're using synthetic aperture radar polarimetry methods, which are able to image the land surface structure and how this changes through time. Some of you may be familiar with this technology, but for those who aren't, it's essentially a way of using radar to detect how much land surface structure can scatter a radio signal. Critically, data collection from SAR satellites, in this case Sentinel-1, is not sensitive to cloud cover and has a return period of around 6 days, producing data sets with a pixel size of around 20 meters. We have developed a bespoke data processing pipeline, which again is designed specifically to process data across very large spatial extents. And all of this processing is actually now done in the cloud using code we run in Google Earth Engine. This means at relatively high temporal frequencies, for example, quarterly, we're able to produce data sets describing recent change in the mapped tree canopies or hedgerows described earlier. I'll now run through some examples of these data. Firstly, in this example from North Devon, we can see that within a relatively large wooded area, we can observe some woodland management taking place, and this is just using conventional airborne imaging data. We can also see other changes in the landscape through time, for example, crop rotation and other cyclic agricultural activities. When we look at these data using radar imaging, we're actually able to build single images from measurements across multiple timeframes. So here is one such image that we produced earlier on in the project, describing changes in the land surface structure during the summers, i.e. June to August, of 2017, 2018 and 2019. In this example, dark areas describe parts of the landscape with a low land surface structure, for example, open fields. Lighter areas describe places that have a higher land surface structure, for example, wooded or urban areas or features. Anywhere in this image where another colour can be seen describe regions of change in the observed land surface structure through time. You can see, annotated onto this image, that this relatively simple remote sensing methodology can detect changes in tree canopies. In this case, tree removal and other land surface changes such as maize crops on rotation. In this part of the project, we essentially combined this change detection with the hedgerow, tree and woodland mapping products you saw earlier to detect relevant changes in the tree canopy heights that we're interested in. I'll now show you some examples of the products of using this technique. So firstly, and potentially most straightforwardly, here are some examples of known areas of tree removal or woodland management that our data processing pipeline picks up as constrained areas for change. We can output these as areas of red pixels in the first instance. In both examples here, you can see that the areas detected as change correspond very closely to the areas of trees removed in the top two images. Here again, some examples of automated detection of commercial woodland management within larger areas of the wooded landscape. These data describe change within the second to third quarter of 2019, and again, these data are able to describe relatively constrained extents of change in the treescape. I should also point out that we are and will be validating many of these detected extents using a combination of ground truthing and alternative remote sensing datasets. The previous two examples I've shared are actually of conifer dominated woodland extents. Here's another example from some of the development work we've done, where a small area of broadleaf woodland has actually been cleared for an alternative land use, which in this case appears to be pasture. In such an example, you can see a step change in the connectivity of the woodland habitat in this part of the landscape, which is a critical thing to be able to monitor. Finally, as our mapping products cover trees, hedgerows and woodlands, we're also able to automatically detect the loss or change in management of hedgerow habitats in some detail. In this example, you can see on the left-hand image the red pixels denoting the extent of change in the hedgerow. In the right-hand image, you can see how this relates to the tree, hedgerows and woodland mapping products, and therefore how we can estimate biomass or habitat changes in the landscape through this detection. So to summarise, our tree, hedgerows and woodland mapping work and SAR change detection data provide relatively simple, repeatable and importantly open source data products that enable the monitoring of patterns of dynamics across treescapes in the southwest. We are producing a tool for our partners to be able to repeat this analysis as needed for the management of treescapes in the areas of the southwest that they cover. This tool is actually based in the cloud, and importantly, this enables our partners to repeat this relatively established analysis as needed in the future, thereby detecting changes to the woodland stock and being able to understand how this relates to the wider treescape. The methods we've used to generate this tool should also give us the ability to retrospectively examine change in the treescape through time, which may be important for understanding past change events. So before I draw this presentation to a close, just to recap what our project outputs will be. Firstly, the habitat mapping data that Naomi has described earlier will provide a baseline map of Dartmoor National Park's complex habitats, and at a resolution far more appropriate to the management of the moorland than other available data sets. Data produced for the habitat mapping will be robust and repeatable and will include a facility to understand accuracy and how this changes through time. It will also facilitate future targeted ground validation in order to maintain ongoing accuracy. In the woodland stock and change detection part of this project, again, we'll be producing a robust and repeatable methodology for change detection across the wooded landscape in the southwest. And we've also produced a robust baseline of woodland stock across trees, hedgerows and woodlands, which can also be repeated in the future as new LiDAR data become available. In terms of what's left to do on the project, much of this is going to be focusing on finalising our methodologies and data, successfully integrating these within our partner organisations, which is a key component. And we'll also be publishing relevant methodologies and results and supplementary analysis that we undertake in the future, and hope that some of the data outputs we produce will be both open source and easily replicable in other areas in the near future. Thank you for listening, and we'll now transition to a short Q&A session before the next presentation.
Thanks very much for a really interesting presentation, everybody. If anybody would like to ask some questions now, please could they raise their hand? To do that, you need to click on the participants box at the bottom of the chat, and then there should be an option for you to raise your hand. Okay, well, in that case,
I think there's one from Amber.
Oh, sorry, Amber. Sorry, I totally missed that. Amber, would you like to turn on your microphone and your?
Yeah, I'm very sorry. It's not Amber. I hate to disappoint you. It's David.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I need to fix this problem. It keeps happening. So Dave, so David Smith from South West Water. Dave, when you look at the Dartmoor map and the habitat classes you have, and then you think about the interventions that have happened on Dartmoor in terms of peatland restoration, are you able to bring the two together to say, we now know from the science you've done around the interventions, we will do soon, what the impacts of those are locally? So can you then use that data set to make, if you like, global predictions across the whole of Dartmoor if you did the same interventions?
Do you want to answer that, Naomi?
If I find the right button to unmute. Yes, so with the interventions need to have an effect on the vegetation that is visible on a 10 meter squared pixel before it will be picked up as changing the habitat type. So this might not be occurring with like over the timescales that we've been working, but ultimately I think it would pick it up and it would enable you to map the landscape effects and I've forgotten what the question was.
So it's more importantly is understanding the water quality and flow impacts that you also have that information from the survey sites on Dartmoor.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes,
so you can quantify that across the whole of Dartmoor. There
would be assumptions based with that obviously that a habitat cover, land cover, has the same effect across different positions within the landscape. And so there would be some big assumptions, but yeah, there's no reason why you couldn't use the habitat class as a base map, then map on ecosystem stocks and so on.
Yeah. So we've never had that ability before because the habitat mapping on Dartmoor and Exmoor has not been dynamic enough to say this is the change, but you now have a mechanism for measuring change.
Yeah, that's certainly the intention. One of the things early on in the project that we actually set out to do was to see if we can use change through time to look at things like stress in certain habitats. But that's why the work that Naomi's been doing on Dartmoor National Park with this tool, the tool should be repeatable for the National Park as a user to do some of that work in the future.
That's great, thanks Dave.
Okay, and we have a question, our next question is from Ian Bateman.
Thank you. Sorry. Hello there. That was just fabulous. There's so much possibility here, and I just wonder where you're going with it. And two ideas that come to mind, which you've probably already thought of. Producing something that was in ways superior to the CH land use map would be fantastic. Producing it on a very regular basis would be really something else. And the second thing that comes to mind is we've got the net zero challenge. We know that that can only be delivered in part by planting trees. At the moment, we are woefully behind the curve. You know, we're supposed to have 30,000 hectares put in. I think last year in England, it was about 1,400, something like that. Have you thought about being able to produce really regular updates on both of those sort of products that you release for free and just, you know, drive a lot of change through that information?
I mean, it's certainly our intent that the information will be free in the future. We're obviously targeting the tools we're producing specifically for the stakeholders that are involved at the moment. But yeah, I mean, the intention is that these sorts of data, well, the information that are in these data that we're helping our partners and other people hopefully unlock, should be able to be used in those contexts very broadly and hopefully over far larger extents in the future. So I don't know if you want to say anything more, Naomi.
Yeah, I would just add, I guess the woodland mapping stock tool is reliant on the availability of LiDAR data and the return flight of that. And that's quite an expensive thing, but it does give us a lot of information, and the government is committing to cover the whole of the country.
Yep.
So that data is there, and hopefully we'll have an increased frequency of return period. And the land classification map, if you remember back to my presentation where I showed the amount of training pixels required, the tool itself could be applicable to other areas, but it has to be tailored for those areas. I mean, if they have very similar landscape types to Dartmoor, you can probably borrow our pixels. But if you're going to have completely different landscape types, then there's going to be work required to get the tool to work for your area. But that doesn't mean to say the tool wouldn't work. It's just, you know, people will have to put some effort into to make it happen.
That's great.
So we have time for one final question. So from Anne Wilcox, please.
Hello, I've got a bit of a combination of questions. So many might be aware that the current BPS mapping that we use has been used on the Dartmoor Commons has caused an awful lot of discrepancy on vegetation classification. So I'm hoping that this mapping is going to be a step change from what we currently have. But how will this mapping sit with any statutory requirements for mapping, and how they're utilised, thinking specifically of any land management plans that come up? We don't want to be in a situation where we have all different companies creating all types of mapping and software that's not compatible. So that's the first part of the question. How will this sit with future schemes? How will it be used? The second part is, I'm hoping that this software will differentiate between a woodland line and gorse, obviously two very separate habitats, but I wouldn't want it to be mapping gorse as little trees. You know, we've got to look at this quite carefully. Ground truthing comes into it, and I think that comes back to what was referred to earlier with the pixels, and updating. So how often is it all to do with the LIDAR flight path that it's updated, or will we have regular that we know it will be updated on a set date? And finally, availability to all, you know, ordinary folks like us, farmers or commoners who might use it to put together schemes. Thank you.
So to pick up on your last point first, the data, it's our intention that once the data are finalised and all of the project partners are happy with the kind of quality and the rigour that we've put into that data acquisition, that those data will be available. That is slightly distinct from the tools, which was the point I was trying to make earlier, in that those tools are designed specifically for the project partners. But yes, the data themselves should be available. The intention is they're available to anyone in any organisation or not, to use as they'd see fit in the future. So there was a few questions in there. So to pick up on the point about how frequently they're repeated. So Naomi, you might jump in here as well, but the baseline tree, hedgerow and woodland data can be repeated when LIDAR data sets are reflown, and they're flown in an aircraft and they're flown on a non-regular basis. So the Environment Agency LIDAR data set is looking to cover the whole country by 2021. We don't know when in 2021 that is, but that's the intention. So we should be able to technically do this anywhere at that point. But those won't all be collected in year 2020 or 2021. Some of them may be older data sets, but as they're reflown, they can be reproduced. The change data sets can be produced every 3 months. So based on where those canopy structures have changed. And Naomi, you can talk about the...
Yeah, so our aim is that the mapping tool would enable the habitat classes to be remapped every year, because they require data over multiple seasons to improve the robustness of the classification. So you can't do it more often than yearly. One of the other questions was about differentiating the woodland line and the gorse. Now, I didn't get whether this was, so both the habitat classification tool and SAW pick out woodland and gorse. So I didn't know which tool or method you particularly were asking about there.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, that's fine. It takes me a while to finally unmute. So yes, that's fine. So as long as your mapping would differentiate, because it's quite important. If you know the woodland is increasing, that's really good. But if you know that gorse is increasing, it might not be good. So differentiation is good. So that's fine. Thank you. And I think the other thing was compatibility.
Yep. We haven't actually looked into this, if I'm going to be honest. I don't know how comparable it will be until we have an output to compare. We won't know. We've obviously set our classes that we intend to use and the different, and we've chosen to use the UK Habitat class, and that is obviously different from like JNCC mapping classes. So there will be some non-direct comparison there. It's hoped that our results would come out with and would be the same as anyone else using the UK Habitat classification mapping on the ground. And when we, when we get to that stage, we will be cross-comparing across with other products.
And in terms of how it fits into statutory reporting and those sorts of complexities, I guess that's kind of more of a question for our partner, Dartmoor National Park, probably, than ourselves. But the latter part of this project is going to be mostly about embedding the data in the organisations, making sure it's the most appropriate formats and compatibilities for them, and that the way it can be repeated in the future is the most useful for those organisations and how they have to interact with the rest of society and the landscape. So I would expect the intention from them is certainly that these data will be useful and tailor-made to be as useful as possible.
Thanks very much, everybody. There's some really interesting questions, some really good discussion here. I suggest any other questions, if we take that up in the breakout rooms at the end of today's presentations. But thanks very much to everyone who's presented in that session. We're going to take a quick break now, and we'll be back here at 2:45. Just as a reminder before anyone leaves, we've also got a very short evaluation. So if everyone would feel free just to fill that in at some point during the next set of presentations, that'd be brilliant. Thank you. It should only take a minute or so to fill out. So see you all at 2:45. Thanks very much. Hi again, everyone. Welcome back to the second half of our session on land management scale approaches. The first presentation in this part of the session is on policy uses of legas.co.uk, which is an exemplar of collaboration with Cornwall Council and AONB to deliver a natural capital approach. And this is from Jonathan Mosedale from SWEEP, Philippa Hoskin from Cornwall Council, and Emma Browning from Cornwall AONB.
Thanks, James. So just to give a very brief outline of what this session is going to cover, I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the LAGAS mapping site. I imagine many of you will be familiar with it and may have even been at the session yesterday afternoon. Then for the majority of this session, we'll hear from Cornwall Council and Cornwall AONB about their reasons for supporting a project and about the policy context and some specific applications that are continuing to inform the development of LAGAS and the mapping products that it presents. And finally, I'll highlight some of the challenges around the creation and the development of LAGAS, which we might want to explore in more detail during Q&A, either immediately following presentation or in the breakout room. So, as I say, this will just be a very brief introduction if you're not familiar with LAGAS. So LAGAS, it's really the product of a partnership between the SWEEP programme and TEVI programmes, and brings together a wide range of partners, really key partners across Cornwall, and funded, therefore bringing together funding by both NERC and by the European Regional Development Fund. So we're going to be really talking about the mapping application in LAGAS. And this is just the opening screen. If you're not familiar with it, you'll have a menu down left-hand side. And most of the products we'll be talking about, the maps we'll be talking about today, will be those in the sort of top of the menu. So things like the nature recovery network mapping. And these are a set of different maps that in a way are quite closely related. So in particular, the existing nature network maps, you could say the existing most valuable biodiverse areas of Cornwall are sort of linked with habitat opportunity maps, where the restoration or creation of habitat might bring the greatest benefit. And these together inform some of these sort of higher level network maps we'll be talking about today. So these are sort of fairly straightforward maps. As I say, you've got various layers. They're sometimes a bit busy. You can easily tidy them up just by using the controls on the right-hand side of the map. And also there'll be sort of information as well. We try and provide a sort of framing question and supporting information on the info button to the right, and there's often additional documents attached with these hyperlinks there. So if you haven't already, then do feel free to explore the site at your leisure before, either during or after this session. The rest of our time now will focus on some of the policy context and specific applications that shape LAGAS. And to begin with, we have Philippa Hoskin from Cornwall Council, who provide some insight into the policy context and specific applications of LAGAS from Cornwall Council's perspective. Thank you. Philippa, are you there? Okay, so as you I guess we've obviously got a bit of a technical problem. Emma, would you be willing to just give a little bit about the AOND perspective while we are trying to sort out Philippa's problems, technical problems?
Hi, Jonathan, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, great stuff. Yeah, I suppose we've got some slides a little bit later that we can refer to, but from an AONB point of view, the AONB has been engaged with the development of LAGAS and with the LAGAS team for quite some time. And I guess what I was going to talk about was the application of LAGAS and what it can do. My predecessor contributed towards LAGAS and specifically focusing on some of the key work for the lizard with some mapping opportunities. And you can see that on the screen now. So this is actually a different resolution to the maps that Jonathan's just shown. So this is at a 10-metre land cover. And this is showing the opportunities overlaid on this particular map and priority areas for nature restoration. And if we skip to the next slide, thanks. This also focuses in on woodland opportunities, which has really helped in terms of using for our lizard elms test and trial. So Cornwall AONB has been leading on one of the elms test and trials, and these maps have really helped to inform that process. So what they've done is use the output of these maps and looked at landscape character assessment areas as well, and then gone into discussions with farmers on what their local priorities are and what could be achieved at a landscape scale for the lizard, and looking at designing objectives with set targets assigned to them. So that's part of the ELMS scheme, and how mapping like this can really help inform that. And I guess the other aspect that I wanted to talk about was the Cornwall AONB management plan. So this is a statutory document and is a material consideration in relation to planning. And this plan is on a 5-year cycle, and we're currently at the stage of re-reviewing it and redrafting that plan. And all this information that's within LAGAS will really help to inform and guide the direction that we go for nature recovery. And we're working very closely with Jonathan and with Pip on this mapping for nature recovery for the national pilot, and also looking at opportunities to actually deliver on the ground. So what I would say is that it's been an amazing collaborative tool that's got scope to be developed much further in collaboration with others, obviously. And I really look forward to using it more in the future. And I don't know if there's anything more you want to draw upon on the maps, Jonathan, when these were designed and produced. Is there anything else we can add to that?
Not really, simply to say these are not publicly available in LAGAS. These were, we were testing out similar mapping methods to those shown on LAGAS, but at the finer resolution Emma mentioned at 10 meters, and just looking at the lizard AONB. So in a way, it's still a bit of an experimental product, but we are looking, particularly with the cooperation of Cornwall Wildlife Trust, to actually try and apply these methods at that finer 10-meter resolution, which are shown in these particular maps. And this is just an example of an account we created for the AONB on the LAGAS site, so we could just show maps to those account members. Pip, welcome. I'll just let, hopefully Paul can sort out slides, and I'll pass over to you straight away.
I think you're on mute, Pip.
Sorry, is it working now?
Yes.
Okay, right, okay, God, I'm so sorry, everybody. Right, okay, I'm Philippa Hoskin. If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, I'm Philippa Hoskin, the Partnerships and Policy Lead at Cornwall Council. And I've been working with Jonathan over the last couple of the years in the development of the LAGAS tools. And I'm going to talk to you about the various sort of policy and practical applications. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this started about 5 years ago and came about partly because Cornwall Council and the Cornwall Local Nature Partnership, Cornwall North Scilly Local Nature Partnership, co-created and adopted the environmental growth strategy for Cornwall, which at its time was really quite groundbreaking. And it was basically saying that protection isn't enough. We need to sort of make more space for nature and apply, you know, the laws and principles, more, bigger, better, more joined up, in order to tackle the ecological emergency. And it was very obvious very quickly that we needed effective decision support tools to turn the strategy into action. And next slide, please. And we're currently in the process of refreshing and reframing the Cornwall Environmental Growth Strategy, 5 years on since adoption. And underneath this sits a series of action plans which collectively deliver on the sort of need, you know, to respond to the climate and ecological emergencies. And the new kid on the block there is the one in the middle, the Nature Recovery Plan, which we're currently working on as we speak. And LAGAS is absolutely fundamental to that process. Next slide. And I think it's important to note that LAGAS is just one of the tools we need. We've got a whole suite of tools and metrics that we've created and in partnership with others to help us guide delivery of environmental growth, but also measure success or failure along the way. And back in 2019, Cornwall Council adopted a climate change action plan with a whole suite of actions set out there to trying to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030 in Cornwall. And LAGAS is key to delivering the natural climate solutions element of this. So I'm sure I don't need to tell all of you, but nature is fairly effective at drawing down carbon and locking it away both on land and at sea, the sort of carbon drawdown. And LAGAS is going to be guiding nature recovery, but also guiding the delivery of the natural climate solutions. So it's enables us to have a tool which helps guide the delivery of sort of biodiversity gain, increasing connectivity, habitat resilience, but also it very effectively enables us to determine where we can maximise the delivery of ecosystem services, including carbon drawdown. Essentially, LAGAS maps the best locations for nature to deliver multiple benefits, and that includes within the protected area network, but also importantly beyond the protected area network, the best of the rest outside the designated sites. You all may have noticed that something called Brexit has been going on over the last few years, and because of that there's a whole raft of new legislation making its way through Parliament, the Environment, Agriculture, Fisheries Bill, and there's new duties within the draft Environment Bill for local authorities to create what are called local nature recovery strategies. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that now. Next slide. So in July, partly in response to the fact that Cornwall already had an environmental growth strategy, was also sort of well progressed in terms of climate action, we were asked by DEFRA to become one of 5 new pilots nationally for producing local nature recovery strategies, along with Buckinghamshire, Cumbria, Greater Manchester and Northumberland. And we sort of started in earnest in September in delivering that. And 2 key requirements of these new local nature recovery strategies is one, a nature recovery network map, and secondly, setting out a sort of more of a narrative of what our nature recovery priorities are for the county. And these might be nature recovery processes, you know, areas, special places, and enablers. Next slide. So LAGAS already acts as our prototype nature recovery network map for Cornwall. So we're sort of well progressed in terms of one of those key outputs required of the nature recovery strategy. And we're looking over the coming months to sort of see how we can enhance it, improve any functionality, and improve the sort of experience for end users, the variety of end users of the mapping tool. So in terms of specifics of how LAGAS can be used, I think there's a whole raft of applications that are being put into practice. One of the ones, I suppose, where there's the least certainty is around the environmental land management systems. So this is the kind of post-Brexit agri-environment funding mechanism. And there's various tiers to that, including tier 2. Oh, apologies, back again. Which is more strategic local prioritisation. So we're working with the Local Nature Partnership and DEFRA as well to explore how the LAGAS maps can be used potentially to guide the environmental land management funding moving forward. We've also got, and one of our sort of flagship carbon neutral activities is called the Forest for Cornwall, which is essentially trying to increase canopy cover by 2% across Cornwall by 2030 because of that carbon drawdown effect. And LAGAS, with the woodland opportunity mapping, is a good support tool for guiding delivery of that, as well as things like the flood grant in aid and other funding mechanisms that can be used to deliver natural flood management, as well as guiding actual things like our council asset management, because we've got a whole raft of green and blue spaces across Cornwall, and this can help to guide that. Next slide, please. So Cornwall, as part of the Environment Bill as well, there's a new requirement for delivery of biodiversity net gain within the planning system. And Cornwall was an early adopter of this. And that from the spring of this year, there was a new requirement for all major infrastructure schemes, major planning applications to deliver a 10% net gain for biodiversity. And, you know, the purpose of this is essentially to try and drive retention of good habitat on site and delivery of on-site biodiversity net gain, of which LAGAS can guide that. But if it isn't possible on site, then the last resort is biodiversity offsetting. And again, the LAGAS maps help to guide where might be the best locations for delivery of biodiversity offsetting off-site outside of the red line boundaries. And we've already using it within the biodiversity net gain calculator that has to be completed as part of this process. So there's a weighting in there relating to spatial location, and LAGAS is already used as part of that weighting in our planning system. So in terms of more sort of spatial planning applications, I think one of the really interesting policy applications of LAGAS is enabling us for the first time to have a very ambitious spatial allocation for nature. So I think many of you will potentially be familiar with spatial allocations for housing that we hear about within our local planning framework. This will be the first time we'll have a genuine allocation for nature. And we've already got a draft policy in our draft climate change development planning document, which you can view online, which essentially ensures that not only the protected area is the environmental sort of protected areas are secured through the planning system, but also what I call the best of the rest, the other areas of Cornwall that are delivering the most ecosystem services or have the greatest opportunity for nature recovery, the opportunity areas. So I think this is a real step change, and it's an example of where LAGAS enables that. It's a decision support tool that can enable that systems change for nature. And we'll also, moving forward, there is sort of planning reform, which some of you might have heard about in the news recently. Again, we're trying to kind of integrate nature recovery via LAGAS into any proposed planning reform and the review of our local plan. So I think in summary, basically, you know, LAGAS has a whole raft of policy and practical applications. And I think part of the key to the successful impact of LAGAS within Cornwall Council and other partners has been this kind of co-design. We've been involved from the outset in working with Jonathan and other colleagues to ensure the sort of functionality and the presentation of LAGAS is fit for purpose for end users. It isn't just a great academic exercise. It's absolutely been designed to be accessible to a variety of users, whether that's developers, their ecologists, potentially development managers, asset managers, and people developing policy. And I think, yeah, this now leading into some joint training sessions, for example, with the university, so we can have sort of super users within Cornwall Council and other partner organisations who can champion the use of LAGAS and ensure that it continues to be used in policy and practice moving forward. So thank you very much, and apologies for the technical issues.
Thanks, Philippa. Thanks very much, and Emma. So we'll just go, just a few closing remarks really, or observations really about the process of developing LAGAS and also our plans for its future development. Really just to underline, we do see the maps as indicative rather than prescriptive. They're there very much to inform strategy and policy development and to form as part of a much wider process of decision making. And in a way, just to underline, but actually understanding where in the decision-making process the maps will be used is actually quite important to the data you then incorporate into them. So for example, we decided to exclude data on some of the social issues, whether social deprivation or land ownership or land price information, simply because we decided that was best captured at a different stage in the policy making process. In terms of sort of legacy as well, fortunately, TEVI has now received additional funding, so that's going to help us sort of maintain and further develop LAGAS into the immediate future. But I think certainly the whole process, it sort of underlined that in a way LAGAS was very opportune in its timing, that a number of policy initiatives, release of the Environment Bill, local nature recovery networks, all this happened at a very opportune for LAGAS, and so we could actually respond to that. I think the whole process certainly underlined that often the window, if you like, to actually influence policy can be quite narrow, and it presents challenges for, shall we say, that those work that's funded in often a very different grant funding timescale. Also, in general, there's a couple of other challenges really, and that's that data is continually evolving, it's continually improving and being updated, whether it's land cover data like we've seen actually in this session earlier, or the other sources of data used within LAGAS, and also the methodologies are evolving and they're going to improve. still quite a challenge trying to assign something like an ecosystem service value across the whole of the landscape. And I certainly hope and expect that these methods will improve. So not only is there then for a sort of technical challenge to make sure that LAGAS can be readily updated and can reflect these changes, but also in a way there's also, I think, a policy challenge in that. How do we ensure that in a way in our policy development, we recognize the fact that the data and the methods will change and will improve over time, how that might affect the way we communicate and present some of these policies. But I think I'll leave it there. If we have any time left, I'll be very happy to answer any questions at this stage or indeed in the breakout session afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we do have time for one or two questions. So if you could just raise your hand. I've seen we've got one here from Joe Oliver in the chat to start with. So Joe, would you like to turn on your microphone and ask a question, please?
Yep. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, can hear you fine.
Yes, we can. Sorry.
A bit of a delay, I think. Thank you. I was just interested in the process that you went through to identify the sort of optimum areas for nature recovery. We looked at woodland on the lizard, but the other sort of habitat types as well.
So we looked at 3 broad habitat types of woodland, wetland and lowland heath. And they both, there is documentation online, which should, I hope, give at least a good outline of the method used. We adopted a sort of zonation type approach, which is software that's been about and a process methodology been about for the last sort of 10, 12 years. It's in a way prioritize or identifies areas on the basis of various layers of data which can receive different weightings, and it also includes factors like improvements to the connectivity of existing habitat. So yes, it sort of effectively gives a ranking to a whole of the landscape at the resolution we chose, which was 100 meters, based on sort of a dozen, well, multiple sort of data sets, which can be weighted according to their reliability. And also, for example, a woodland exposure, we sort of measured wind exposure across the landscape, and that was used as a sort of negative weighting against future woodland creation opportunities, which also in a way also reflected sort of aspects of a Cornish landscape where you tend to get sort of certainly more native woodlands that you find on those river valleys, which are relatively sheltered locations. That's a big question. I think maybe sort of look at the documentation on the LAGAS site, and then, you know, do ping us a question or get in contact if you have any further sort of questions about the detail of the methodology.
Great, thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, so we need to wrap up these questions by 1:15. I think we have, we've got a question from Anne Wilcox, please.
Hello, yes, it's about this LAGAS mapping. I was really impressed with. I like the fact that it mapped not only the environment, but microclimate, urban change and business activity. The only problem with it is it stopped at the Cornwall boundary. So why and how we've just talked about another mapping system being developed on Dartmoor and in Devon, and this one is in Cornwall. Why are we working in silos? Maybe I've missed it, maybe we're not. There's so many good ideas. Why are they not being brought together? Is it about funding that's preventing collaboration? Will all of this be rolled out across the country? How will it integrate? Because this LAGAS is superb. There's no two ways about it. It has potential, I think, to be used by a lot of people, but across the country. So it is about integration of all of these mappings, and I would hate to think that we're using individual pots of money to create something the same on a county by county basis.
Yeah, I agree with all that, really. I think it's a result of, yes, the funding mechanism. Certainly for the part of three parties involved, it had a very particular geographical focus. There can be benefits to that, in that it then lets you tailor the methods and the maps to a region or location. And a bit like we even heard of the land cover, sometimes that has to be actually adapted, the methodology adapted for certain regions. But do I think there's a huge challenge to try and draw together and coordinate all these different mapping methods, sites which are slowly coming online. Yes, I do. Be interesting to see how we can do that. I'm not so sure. Philip, I don't know if you've got any thoughts, or Emma.
I mean, I can say, I mean, DEFRA are producing Nature Recovery Network map at a national scale, but the level of detail and kind of complexity of the information behind it doesn't go anywhere near what's gone into Lagas. I think I don't know if there's anyone here from sort of Natural England or whatever that might have a comment on that, but yeah, I think that's a question for DEFRA, possibly, Anne.
I think it is also a challenge for universities actually to try and find a funding mechanism and a way of working that goes beyond the project. And unfortunately, I don't think we're quite there yet. But it is definitely a challenge for universities if they really want to have impact and inform policy in the long term.
Okay, thank you very much. I see there are a couple of other questions. We're going to have to move on with our programme now, but just a reminder again that we do have an opportunity for breakout rooms to sort of discuss these issues in a bit more detail. And I'll sort of talk about how those breakout rooms will run after this next presentation. So for our final presentation of the afternoon, how can we deliver environmental net gain in practice in both the terrestrial and marine sectors, exploring knowledge gaps, social preference trade-offs and delivery mechanisms? This is from Michaela Faccioli, Diana Tingley and Tara Hooper, who are all from SWEEP.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, James, for that introduction. So James has just outlined the title of our talk, how can we deliver environmental net gain in practice, both in terrestrial and marine sectors? We're actually going to be presenting some slides at the beginning as part of a presentation and an exposition of some of the ideas, but we also would like very much to encourage as many comments and as much feedback as possible, questions, ideas, thoughts. We would like to hear from everybody. We'd like to use this as a sort of a workshop activity to launch the start of SWEEP's newest project, which this is. So I am Diana Tingley. I'm working on this project actually under the banner of a SWEEP Impact Fellow. I've got a background in fisheries and environmental economics, and I also work as SWEEP's Impact Evaluation Manager across all of the projects. It's very interesting to engage with SWEEP at different levels. Michaela Faccioli is also a SWEEP Impact Fellow, and she's going to be talking in a few minutes. She's an environmental economist, and her work focuses on economic valuation of the environment to quantify and monetize the benefits that society obtains from conservation of the natural environment. We're also going to be joined by Tara Hooper, who's a SWEEP Impact Fellow at University of Plymouth and has a background in marine ecology with a particular focus on marine environment policy and management issues. And we're going to be joined by Vicky Morgan, who is lead for marine natural capital issues at the JNCC, that's the Joint Nature Conservation Committee. She's going to be giving us a perspective from the marine side of things. And Ian Bateman, our director of the LEAP Institute at Exeter University, who's heading up the SWEEP project, is also a member of the Natural Capital Committee, advising government and treasury on sustainable use of natural capital issues. He's going to be giving us perspectives from the terrestrial side of things. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, no, hang on a second. Sorry, James, can we go back? Yep, thanks. I'd just like to mention our project partners. At the moment, we start projects off with a range of project partners. At the moment, we have interest from Devon Wildlife Trust, South West Water, Westwood Housing, the Environment Bank, North Devon Biosphere, North Devon Council. But we're very much a broad church, and we're very interested in engaging with as many people, stakeholders, project partners as are interested in being involved with us. So everybody's welcome, and we can talk more about that as the session progresses. Next slide, please. We're going to start off, Michaela's going to start off by just giving a basic outline of the difference between biodiversity net gain and environmental net gain. Many of you will be familiar with these concepts, but some may not, and we're very welcoming to anybody who has any level of understanding. And we're going to use this as a sort of a brainstorming thought session to help plan the next stages of our project, which is aiming to inform the design and implementation of socially desirable environmental net gain schemes to offset development-driven environmental losses. Over to Michaela.
Thanks, Diana. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michaela Faccioli. As Diana said, I'm an environmental economist working on SWEEP, and I will just start off this workshop with some very broad concepts just to put everyone on the same page. So as we know, demands for investments in housing and infrastructure come from the needs to satisfy the working and living demands of an increasing population. In England alone, for example, the government is planning to build 300,000 new homes each year by mid-2020s. And furthermore, there are smaller and larger scale transport and other types of infrastructure developments underway across the UK, including new train lines, bridges, roads, wind farms, etc. So all these pose significant pressures on the environment, and in recent years, concerns about these issues have translated into the adoption, as we've heard before, of a biodiversity net gain approach to planning, which has become mandatory after being incorporated into the Environment Bill in 2019. So the idea of biodiversity net gain is that following the mitigation hierarchy, which is outlined in the graph, developers and planners have to avoid as much as possible biodiversity degradation from the outset. They have to minimize its duration, intensity, or extent when impacts cannot be avoided, and to restore degraded ecosystems when impacts cannot be avoided or minimized. And for any residual impact that is left, offsetting is needed to at least cancel off impacts to achieve no net loss, and where possible, achieve a net gain with a target of 10% improvements. So for example, building new houses in a forested area will require not only the planting of a new woodland somewhere else, but also choosing specific tree species that, for example, can offer habitat for wildlife to further enhance biodiversity. So at the moment, biodiversity net gain is assessed using the Biodiversity Metrics 2.0 developed by Natural England, which convert information on the size of habitat parcels into equivalent biodiversity units by applying some weights. So for example, the more distinct the habitat, the better its ecological condition, the closer to the development site, and the higher the interconnection or interdependencies with other habitats, the higher the weights that will be applied. To establish the biodiversity impacts of given developments, biodiversity units need to be calculated pre-intervention to set the baseline and post-intervention to evaluate expected change. And the difference needs to be positive in order to deliver net biodiversity gain. In addition, more points are added to the final score of the post-intervention scenario if offsetting is achieved through effective management interventions, if improvements are delivered as soon as possible, and if the offset project takes place close to the development site. More recently, though, the government's 25-year environment plan, the Natural Capital Committee, and the Planning White Paper all advocated for an extension of the biodiversity net gain principle to an environmental net gain approach. The concept of environmental net gain, which is not yet mandatory but might be in the future given its policy traction, is based on the idea that developments can have repercussions not only on biodiversity, but also on a range of other dimensions, such as food, farmers' income, timber production, which are all market goods, as well as on a range of other non-market ecosystem goods and services that people appreciate and value, such as carbon sequestration, recreation opportunities, good air and water quality, and so on. So this represents a fundamental shift compared to the biodiversity net gain paradigm, as it focuses on the importance of the environment to people. However, how exactly an environmental net gain approach should look like has not been clearly outlined yet. So an early stage attempt at measuring environmental net gain, as we've heard yesterday from the first session of the EXPO, is, for example, the eco-metric tool designed by Natural England and the University of Oxford. The eco-metrics are very similar to the biodiversity metrics. They apply some scores to area-based information, but instead of quantifying biodiversity units, they measure ecosystem services units. The ecometrics require the achievement of biodiversity net gain in the first instance, but one of the main limitations is that the scores only reflect biophysical information about habitats' potential to provide ecosystem services. Translating information about the biophysical flow of ecosystem services in monetary terms can be useful, as these monetary metrics embed information about how ecosystem services contribute to human well-being and welfare, and what are societal priorities. They are comparable and can easily be used by policymakers to prioritize public investment decisions. However, while the costs of offsetting project implementation are generally known, the scale of the social benefits afforded are frequently uncertain or unknown. So to contribute to fill these gaps, we set up a new SWEEP project, which started last September and will last until October 2021, where we will explore in a survey the general public's perspectives about environmental net gain compensation schemes. More specifically, this project will aim to identify the economic values derived from a range of environmental net gain compensation scenarios. And in addition, we will aim to characterize and understand the role of spatial factors such as size, location, ecological characteristics as well, and the characteristics of the affected population. We know that the location of any compensation scheme is generally a major determinant of the social benefits it delivers. Near is better than further away. However, changes in location are also likely to alter the distribution of the ecology, which would affect the capacity of ecosystems to produce goods and services. And these may also interact with other drivers of value, such as the scale of the compensation project or the availability of alternative offsetting sites with similar characteristics. And of course, as the location of a compensation project varies, so will the socioeconomic characteristics of the benefiting population, as projects move closer or further away from richer or poorer communities. At the moment, all these represent still open questions. So exploring the above can inform policymakers and relevant organizations regarding what should be compensated, for whom, where, and how, to guide the design and delivery of socially desirable net environmental gain schemes. So to inform the next steps in the project, we would like to involve you in a structured discussion regarding some key questions that Diana will outline in a minute.
Hi, thanks, Michaela. Okay, so we'd like to ask 4 key questions today, and we've blocked off sort of 10-15-minute sections to do that. We'd also like to understand something about everybody who's here with us today. And so in a few moments, we're going to have a little poll pop up on the screen. And we'd like to understand which group you might come from and what you are interested in or already know about or work in, what your sort of background focus is. We would like to hear from everybody, and all opinions are welcome. And these can be delivered through the raise hand function. Sorry, that wasn't moving on a slide. The raise hand function, or you could type in through the chat function. So we're going to look at all the comments that come through afterwards. So everything that you contribute in whatever way will be useful to us. Now, could we move to the next slide, please? Okay, and could you please put the poll up on screen? So we'd be really grateful if you could just take a moment to just fill this out for us, please. Paul, will the poll stay on screen if we move on to the next slide? If so, can we move on to the next slide, please? Thanks. Just whilst we're waiting for everybody to fill out the poll, I can feed back the responses. These are the 4 main questions that we're going to be asking. And so they're very broad, and we've got some sub-questions in slides which will follow to head up these sections. So the first large question is, why should we move from biodiversity to environmental net gain? So that big, broad question. And then the sort of practical nature of it, what would be the scale and the scope? What is the vision for it sort of on the ground? And then the other practical question, how could you actually go about it? How could you finance it, implement it, regulate it, and so on? And then finally, as a kind of wrap up, you know, what are the key issues that maybe we should be prioritizing on for our project? Let's have the next slide, please, Paul. Oh, sorry, next bit. Yep, that's good. Okay, no, that's fine, that's fine. I'd like to know if we've got the results of the poll yet, Paul. I'm just looking at my 76% of people have responded. We'll just maybe give it a minute, and then I'll talk through this first slide, and then we'll find out who's in the room. Okay, yeah. Okay, I'll let Paul know when to close the poll. So I'm just going to finish talking through this slide. So you've just got a couple of more minutes to complete it. So the first broad question that we'd like to address is this issue of biodiversity to environmental net gain. What is the purpose, for whose benefit, and what are the challenges and the opportunities? Michaela is going to lead on the discussion for this question. I'm just going to check to see the poll. Can I have the poll results now, please? Okay, so we've got 31% of people in the room are from environmental organisations, 28% academic, 11% implementation organisations, policymakers 6%. We've got a very small number of developers and planners, which is fantastic. We'd definitely like to be hearing from you, and community group representation as well, and general public. That's great. We've got 60%, 61% work mainly focuses on terrestrial habitats, but 16% on marine as well, which is really interesting, and then 20% on both, which is great. How familiar are you? 64% somewhat familiar, 15% just learnt about it now, and 21% very familiar. Great. And 40% of people in the room have some previous experience with biodiversity net gain and other forms of environmental offsetting projects. That's excellent. Thank you so much for completing that. I'm going to hand over to Michaela now.
Thanks, Diana. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I would start by inviting either Vicky Morgan from JNCC or Ian Bateman. I would start from Ian, that I see on screen already. If you want to sort of share your thoughts and your views about basically these questions that we have outlined in the slide. So why should we be thinking about moving from biodiversity to environmental net gain? What should we be doing this for? I mean, are we doing this for the environment, for people? Whose benefits should we be considering? Everyone's benefits, specific groups of people? And what are the challenges and opportunities that you see in relation to that? I think I forgot to mention we have like about 1 minute or two. So just very quick thoughts.
I have to be very quick, right?
Thank you.
The main thing is you cannot, this is a system, the environment is a system, you cannot change biodiversity without changing everything else. And therefore it simply doesn't make sense to just say, I only care about one thing and I'm going to ignore all these other correlated effects that will happen. That's the sort of decision making that gives you the common agricultural policy and all of its consequences. Whose benefits? I suppose that I come at this from a sort of well-being point of view. I think we should be considering the benefits that come both to society in general, rather than to specific groups, but also given that we have got a real problem with biodiversity, both here and internationally, we have to consider the impact on species as well. And challenges and opportunities, understanding those that system of effects, how they all change. But I actually think the biggest challenge is actually in trying to get the policy orientated correctly, so that it's not hived off to satisfy particular, arguably small concerns and small groups, and should instead be focusing towards benefits for society and for biodiversity.
Great, thank you very much, Ian. Can I just call Vicky now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello. We can't see you though, I think.
Oh, can't you?
Let me see. Yes, yes, we can now. Yeah.
Okay, lucky you. So yes, I agree with everything that Ian said. It's for people, and it has to be for biodiversity and the environment as well. And but a lot of the main driver for that is for people. I think what the reason I think we do want to move towards environmental net gain, in my opinion, and it's because it allows us to think much bigger and to be more flexible and to actually get bigger gains both locally and globally. And of course, because it does allow us to think bigger and to be more flexible, those are the exact same reasons why some people are very anxious and cautious about it, which is understandable. I think for Michaela's slide, you could see there's a sort of often described as sort of staircase from no net loss to biodiversity net gain. Sometimes natural capital net gain gets in there, and then environmental net gain. And the sort of policy direction is to climb up that staircase, which begs the question of why not go straight to the top if that's where we think we want to be eventually. But the reason for that really is that there isn't really a consensus in the whole policy and stakeholder community that is what we want. And so the sort of going stepwise up the staircase is the pragmatic approach to take at the moment. There are some differences with marine and terrestrial. I'm sort of here to represent the marine perspective. The seas aren't in private ownership. They're owned by the Crown, and that makes an enormous difference. It is a much more dynamic and energetic system. It's much more three-dimensional, and I know woods are three-dimensional and there's the air and all the rest of it, but even so, seas are much more three-dimensional than you're perhaps used to considering. And the other big difference, which is a really challenging one, is that there's so much less data. You think you don't have enough data on land to say what you want to. Try working in the marine environment. But it's all, I think, environmental net gain is even more important for marine than it is terrestrially, actually. And that one big reason for that is that many of the benefits that we get from it are completely out of sight and out of mind to most people. Most people are beginning to understand that woods in a catchment will protect them from flooding, and they're beginning, a smaller number are beginning to understand that having a salt marsh can protect them from flooding. Very few of us yet understand perhaps the lateral benefits of protection from wave energy, from dynamic sediment. So it may not be just the bit of land behind the salt marsh, but maybe a sand dune is protecting somewhere several miles along the coast. And all that sort of stuff is really opaque to people, and they don't understand. And as for any understanding of how much carbon there is in the deep sea, it's really hard to get people to understand, or the nutrient sequestration that the sea also carries out for us are really, really important and really out of sight. So if we can find different and better ways to value them, we can really make a difference. The other thing I wanted to say is that in the sea is a busy place. There's lots and lots of people using it, and they're all passionate about how they think it should be managed and what it's there for. But even so, compared to on land, there's more space. We've got more freedom to innovate. We've got more opportunities really to do things differently. There are some very powerful stakeholders, but there are fewer stakeholders really at sea than on land, and that gives us more freedom, I think, to innovate. And my personal sort of ambition for this is to grow natural capital. I think we can use net gain to grow natural capital and maybe even get these bigger gains that are part of environmental net gain. The last point I wanted to say about the whys really was there's this rule of thumb. I don't think it's quite written into law yet, but it's certainly the consensus that biodiversity net gain means a sort of 10% uplift on land. I personally think we could be much more ambitious at sea and be looking for bigger and more aspirational gains and improvements. Maybe not all funded through development. Maybe there are other ways we can get funding this, but I don't think we should sort of think, oh, if we get 10% more, we'll have enough. And so I think that our challenge is to identify that aspiration and use all our resources to work towards it, really.
Thanks, Vicky. That was really, really interesting. So now I just wanted to, because we don't have the perspective of the developer, at least not in our selected speakers panel, if you want, but I'm sure there might be someone else from the audience that might be interested to intervene. But we got some views that Diana wants to read out from Barbara Shaw.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Michaela. On our stakeholder group, we have a lady called Barbara Shaw, who's the Chief Executive of Westwood Housing Group, which is a housing association in the Southwest. It's a developer landlord building new homes across the region, working in partnership with local authorities to rent homes to those who need it. So working in the sort of social housing sector sphere, and which is interesting. In contrast to Vicky's point about the sea being sort of not under private ownership, whereas land obviously has that very unique difference. So Barbara's comments in response to the sort of the wider questions that we're posing are consideration of the costs of implementing environmental net gain and how that would fall back. Would that fall back to developers? Would that then in turn affect the quality of the builds, the viability of the builds, the delivery of affordable homes? Would that further disadvantage the most vulnerable parts of society? Would landowners become less likely to sell land if it drives down land values? Would it lead to the development of more profitable high value homes at the expense of more affordable family, open housing, market housing? And could it lead to enrichment of already biodiverse areas without any discernible benefit to residents in the new homes? And being off-site would not be an advantage to those in affordable homes, as they're less likely to have the means to visit these locations due to the cost and potential lack of transport. So over to you, Michaela. We've just got like maybe a couple more minutes on this section,
yes.
5 minutes and shorten the next one.
Yeah, so I wanted to just open up to discussion from the rest of people participating in this session to see if there was any other or maybe different view that we could sort of capture at this stage, or any additional thought that anyone wants to, to contribute to at this stage.
Use the raise hand function if you'd like to contribute.
Yes,
anything, please.
Thanks. I think there was a comment in the chat, at least from Paul. Yeah, I don't know if Paul, you want to.
Or Ian's replied to as well.
Well, I just think Paul makes a very good comment. What Paul's really saying is, well, I don't want to jump in. I mean, Paul, do you want to say what you want to say?
Thanks, Ian. No, I don't have anything particular to add to what I said. I suppose I'm old enough to have seen lots of wonderful initiatives of this sort kind of raise their heads, get discussed, have lots of profile for a while, and then kind of gradually fade. And sort of my concern would be that biodiversity net gain has got quite a head of steam behind it, and there are some sort of agreed protocols and parameters it just needs doing. And I would hate to see it sort of dragged back into a kind of morass of complexity of trying to do it to everything at once. That's really my only comment. There's no disagreement about the fundamentals of it being a good thing.
Yeah, I think in principle we probably both agree with each other that we should be doing environmental net gain. Biodiversity net gain would be an awful lot better than the nothing that we've got at the moment. I am concerned though about how well either approaches are actually going to be implemented, but I think this is going to come up in question 2, which I think we're going to move to pretty soon.
Yes, So I think there was, well, there are a few other questions that I'm not sure I will get to, but definitely the first question that I have on my list is by Mark on the affordability point. Do you want to add anything else, Mark, to your comment there?
Hello,
Hi.
Summers Catchment Partnership. It was only actually a point in terms of when you're looking at the amount of land that's available for development. Do we understand how much is currently owned, kind of ready to develop, but being sat on? It was a side issue. It wasn't really a question. It's an observation, and it's a question we should ask ourselves.
But this sort of draws the attention, I think, on the point of should we care about the less well-off in our society as well, which I think is something we were interested in hearing more from the audience as well. So thanks very much for
absolutely very much
this point. Yeah,
very much so. I think we are short of truly affordable housing, and poverty is a major issue.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think I'm just trying to read quickly the other questions that we have in the list, but maybe they are linked to the next set of questions that I think we are sort of ready to move to. Oh, there was Harriet, I think. Let me see. There was a raised hand, so I think I'll take that one before moving on. Harriet, do you want to
Yes, if I
question? Hi.
Oh, hello. Yes, if I could just chip in terms of for whose benefit. So I'm currently working on the Dartmoor Elm test and trial, and the concept of net gain has kind of really distorted their understanding of who is responsible for kind of environmental delivery within Elm, because it raises the prospect that a lot more of the burden of responsibility, I guess, sits with landowners, because they're the ones that potentially are most likely to benefit from cash injection for delivery of net gain, and it could sort of really undermine the financial position depending on the formula through which it's delivered, which is what we're discussing. There's a lot of concern from tenants of land that their role as stewards of the land could be undermined by the impact that net gain has on the kind of the land management sector. So just to flag that that's been a really key issue of discussion for us.
Thank you for your thought. I was trying to read as well the other comments that we have in the chat, but I think there are too many comments. So can I just suggest from now on if we can use the raise hand function, so it's more manageable from our perspective as well to sort of pick the questions. But I will try to sort of get back to these questions as we move to the next set of.
Or keep the comments coming in the chat function, because it's all really useful for us, and we'll look at it all afterwards. Yeah, but if you have a particular question for everybody, use raise hand, please.
Okay, so can we move to yes, thank you. So the next, I guess it's all about the same sort of reasoning, and we partly have touched about it already, but we are basically wondering, well, we wanted to get some feedback and more insights from everyone involved in this session regarding how environmental net gain could be delivered in practice in terms of scale and scope. I think we have heard a bit already from our selected speakers, but also from the audience about some perspectives regarding these points. But basically, we were thinking in terms of what sort of development should we be considering in terms of, so what should be subject to environmental net gain law or whatever will be mandated? Is it any type of development, or should we just focus on housing, or are we considering also transport, other types of infrastructure? I think we've heard a bit already about the need to also consider the marine environment in addition to only land. So that's another point we were interested in hearing more about. What sort of locations should we be consider in terms of delivering the environmental net gain project? Should it be just on site? projects, or should we consider also the opportunity to compensate for development-driven environmental degradation in other areas, and maybe through the use of habitat bankings, if that was a possibility at all? And should we be considering the reinforcement of existing environmental networks, or should we be considering other sort of approaches? And what should be the scale of delivery? Should we be just focusing on the local level, or would it be a good idea to consider like a broader scale, regional or national? And again, what are the challenges and opportunities related to, in this case, the delivery and implementation in particular? So I would start again with Ian to have like a couple of ideas on that, and then I will move to Vicky before opening up to the rest of the audience. Thank you.
Okay, first one very quickly, scope. I think most things should be within scope here. I think you should be applying this pretty widely. I think there is a minimum scale that you probably in practice would have to add, but apart from that, my big worry with the whole net gain issue is to do with location. There has been a lot of lobbying and assumption and popular support for the idea that you compensate as close to the site of development as possible. I think this is potentially, it sounds a great idea, but I think it's potentially very, very dangerous and could actually produce exactly the opposite result that we want. 4 reasons very quickly. If you tie the compensation next to a building site, you're not addressing any of the sort of Lawton making space for nature ideas for biodiversity. It's about as unoptimal as you can get. The chances that what you're doing is the right place for biodiversity are almost nil. Secondly, at a micro scale, by doing that, what I've seen of developments is that the gains go all to the winners. So you'll have a new development and you'll have the executive homes on the outside, and all the compensation is for those executive homes to actually help raise their prices. And it completely ignores the fact that this area was being used previously by a population who is now completely dispossessed of that area. You're actually you're rewarding the winners and penalizing the losers. Third thing, this rule will completely negate any chance of helping the most disadvantaged in society, because we don't build in the poorest areas of this country. We build in leafy suburbs and areas around cities. If you force the compensation to be in that area, then the inner city areas will not benefit from this at all. And finally, I do think there is a potential really nasty incentive here, that if you're a planning authority and you think, right, we can capture all of this compensation in our area, then that is going to set up a competition to make sure that development happens in your area and not in somebody else's area. In other words, you could actually be contributing to more development going on rather than less as a result of this. So I'm really quite concerned. I think the net gain sounds like a great idea. It could be a great idea, but if the detail is not sorted out, it could actually be worse than actually the situation at the moment, which is pretty bad.
Thanks very much, Ian. I agree with all your points, basically, so nothing else to add there. But I just wanted to ask if Vicky has something to add here. I think you've touched already on some of the points before from a marine perspective.
A couple of small things. Yes, I agree with Ian, including that it can be everything. It's much easier in marine to decouple the location of the impact from the location of delivery. There are things you can do on site, like artificial reefs at the bottom of wind farms and reducing fishing and so on. But basically, it's much easier to decouple. I can't say much about how we do it because we're way behind terrestrial in terms of any sort of understanding of metrics or how to get to where we want to go. They're working on a biodiversity metric for intertidal because legally they have to, it's causing trouble. But in terms of delivery and what I think there's a lot we could do and a lot we could do quite quickly, and it's what I'm sort of pushing for. I'm not sure if I'm being heard, in actually coming up with a strategic set of priorities of where we want to restore the environment and natural capital, and so that we could actually quite easily come up with a map and a list of sites waiting for the gains to happen. Once we've agreed a system and a metrics, and of course that list wouldn't only be of use for net gain, it would be of use for anybody who wants to invest in environmental improvements.
So this shouldn't be a reason for not doing stuff, really, right? That's your point, I guess, that, you know, even if the marine sector is behind the terrestrial, there's
lots of it we don't know how to do, but that's something we do know how to do, and we could do it, and it would have multiple uses.
Exactly, it just takes a bit of time. Okay, thanks very much. That was really interesting. I think there was a question from David Smith from Southwest Water. David, do you want to ask your question?
Hello, yes, I'm here. Thank you. So it was really to say that I think I agree with what Ian said. I am very anxious about some of this, but I think the opportunity is there. And we really need to focus in on some of the specifics that can happen and need to happen. And I highlighted phosphate there. So when new houses go into a catchment, they all add to phosphate. And there's been a requirement when you're doing this in an SAC to make sure the developers come up with a phosphate plan. And I think that's something that could be extended more widely. At the moment, we as Southwest Water, as the sewage operator, have to take that phosphate and process it from that new housing development if we're able to, if the network is there. We have no option but to accept new housing. If we can accept it into our network, we have to. But this is another potential delivery route for keeping that phosphate out of the catchment if they come up with their own plans as developers. So I think that's a good opportunity. And then also I wanted to say that, you know, at Southwest Water, we're working across our significant landholding. We've got 6,000 hectares to net gain on the things we do in that landholding, and also as an infrastructure developer, we also have a net gain target in the operations that we carry out on other people's land. So as a developer ourselves, we are thinking about those things, but we haven't, if you like, crossed the Rubicon and started taking or offsetting gain from other people. But we could, because we have high ambitions for what we spend, what we do on our land holding, but we simply don't have the customer money to support our ambitions for biodiversity improvement. And it's not necessarily a customer priority to spend their money on that. So we have a big land holding that has a real opportunity. So net gain potentially could be a way for us to fund that opportunity on that land holding.
Thank you, David. That was interesting to hear also from the business perspective. So I don't know if there is any other question or comment, anything that anyone else with maybe a different profile wants to add? Any other perspective we haven't included so far? Yeah, Mary Rose.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, sorry. Yeah, I put it in the chat, but something that just occurred to me during this discussion is, and I'm being slightly devil's advocate, but I haven't heard it talked about yet, is for those who are potentially currently exploiting the spaces we're talking about, whether it's terrestrial or marine, so some forms of fishing, some forms of farming, and by no means all, should they also be required to deliver environmental net gain, because they also potentially are recipients of the compensation or the funds to, received for delivering better soil, better carbon, whatever, whilst continuing potentially damaging activities themselves. So I've never heard that spoken about. It's only occurred to me for the first time now, but I just wonder whether that's something that's being considered.
I've seen Ian raising his hand. Do you want to?
Yeah, you're making a great point. And like in principle, I completely agree with you. I just think I can't see it happening. I think pragmatically that's a non-starter. I'd also flag up a really nice point made by Philip Hoskin, which actually is in a Natural Capital Committee report that we've written. You've got to be really careful introducing these rules that you don't trigger a whole set of preemptive actions. For example, if you have a piece of land and it's of very high environmental quality and you want to build on it, then the best thing you can do is to destroy the quality of that land before it gets assessed for net gains. And then the compensation you have to pay is obviously pretty minor. So you've got to try and think about the unintended consequences of of all policies actually. But I would say that on the issue, the specific issue I was saying, I suppose I think it's probably a bridge too far, and that's just based on my experience of how policy works at the moment. So I don't disagree with you, I just can't see it happening.
Great, maybe we have time for one quick question, if it is quick, Deborah.
Thank you. Yeah. You're smiling. You can hear me. Sorry, I might have missed it. I had to dip out and do the school run. But it's not just about habitat quality. It's about the functional attributes of that habitat. And by that I mean we know that wetlands can purify water. We know that grasslands that might otherwise be uninteresting can support foraging bats. And I think that's another really important point, and maybe bears out what Ian was saying about it's not just about location being close to loss, because if you're upgrading the functional attribute of the land, because you're not supposed to sort of whatever it is downgrade, then you might actually be making a case to say this compensatory land for biodiversity net gain would actually be better placed for all these reasons, more remote from my development. Thank you.
Thanks. I think this is a point I've heard a lot of comments on this, and I think a lot of other people agreed. So that's probably one of the main conclusions we can draw from the session, but just a preliminary one before we get to the end. So yeah, I would like to now leave the floor to Diana to lead on the other two remaining questions that we have.
Okay, next slide, please. So this third question is about sort of the practicalities, the financing, the implementation, the regulating. What are the options, the sort of big possible options? Who should be doing the delivering? How could things be financed? Issues of timescale and accountability. I've noticed that Angie Greenham has been posted some comments about South Hams District Council, who under their draft biodiversity strategy have been taking the 10%, taking the monies, I'm trying to read it very quickly, but basically taking the monies from developers and doing a form of offset themselves. So taking action themselves as a planning authority, which is one of the practical routes to delivery, which is interesting. And we've also been talking to the people who work at the Environment Bank, which is I think it's a business. It's been set up to help facilitate that process of working with planning authorities, coming up with a system which enables the developers to sell the credits for potential environmental net gain offsets to allow a form of sort of different levels of offsetting, sort of large-scale habitat banks or more bespoke offset sites in proximity to the developed area. But it's done this through this sort of credit brokerage system with covenants put in place for setting out how the land or the environment would, the site would be managed for 30 years in advance to sort of build in all the requirements that are needed to ensure that the system works. So it'd be interesting to hear the responses from Vicky first, perhaps, on these sorts of notions, followed by Ian, please.
Oh, sorry, I was just replying to the question about fishing and I wasn't 100% listening. Can you tell me remind me what the question is? I do apologise.
We're on question 3. So it's how could environmental net gain be financed, implemented, and regulated?
Okay, brilliant. So there's lots of scope. There's lots of different financial products that could be considered. We're very, very far from having identified any or be looking to go with any at the moment. I think some of the principles that we'd want to look at are that there need to be a lot of good quality data for monitoring and compliance evidence. It needs a sort of and assurance for investors, and that probably that area could well be a role for sort of government support and investment. So maybe the financial instruments that we might be looking to move towards where would sort of leverage out government spend on monitoring and evaluation, so as to provide this confidence for investors to come in and actually pay for some of the actions and activities that could deliver the benefits. I'm terribly sorry I wasn't listening when you introduced that. I can't type and think and listen at the same time, it turns out. And I can't raise my hand because I can't find the buttons.
Thank you, Vicky. That was great. I have the same problem with listening and reading at the same time. Ian, would you like to give a response?
Yeah, I think this is a difficult but good question to ask. It's very easy to just say, well, it should be financed by the developers. We've got to be a little bit careful about that, because particularly if obviously that there is an issue about the costs of this relative to the benefits of different types of homes. In particular, I'm thinking about affordable homes. So if this policy resulted in a further reduction in the availability of affordable homes, that would obviously be a really negative externality. And I think in shaping this, the government should be I think they should be using a regulation approach, because there is a cost here that is being imposed upon society, and we want to move that away from society. But we have to be careful that we don't impose a second cost as a result of this. So, for example, one way you could do this is actually think about government part support for this. In the case of affordable home building, I don't think there'll be a lot of support for government money going into executive estates, but I do think affordable homes need to be removed from being mitigated against here. With regard to regulation and delivery and implementation, I have been impressed over the last 20 years by the mitigation bank industry in the US, because what that's done is it's allowed ecologists and other science experts to come into the process at the right point, because I am an economist and I do think there's a role for economics in here, but ultimately it shouldn't actually be economists determining whether the biodiversity compensation element is acceptable or not. And mitigation banking allows you to pull resources together and deliver high quality mitigation, often at a bigger scale than if you just do these little elements around the country. And I'll just close on that one point. There is a huge literature out there which conclusively shows that if you take an amount of compensation, either land, I'm not a marine expert, but and you dish it out in tiny strips around the place, you know, field margins and that sort of stuff, it has far less impact improving biodiversity than trying to bring this land together into one consolidated habitat. And that's one of the benefits that banking could give.
Okay, thank you, Ian. And thank you, Vicky. I can't see any other raised hands. So in the absence of a raised hand going up, oh, Andrew Ross, would you like to unmute and tell us your thoughts?
If I may, nobody has mentioned green finance in this context, and local authorities have the gift of planning consent, and they could issue municipal green bonds requiring environmental net gain, and the bonds would be bought by insurers and pension funds that would unleash enormous sums of money to be able to invest in aggregated sets of natural capital projects on a whole catchment and a whole district scale. And that's surely the way forward that HM Treasury will support.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. That's it's a very interesting and different perspective on things, broadens things out for us. Time to move on to the next slide, I think, because we've only got a few more minutes left in this session. So the last bit is a kind of a wrap up for the session and some ideas for Michaela and I to take forward, and Tara into the future for this survey work. We'd like to know if there's any voices that haven't, or any sort of voices or perspectives that you feel have not been well represented today. We've kind of talked about environmental net gain becoming a reality. Could it become a reality? Is it likely to? Should that, I guess in a way, the pitch of the project is to focus on the potential that it could become a reality. I think for the social preference survey side of things, Michaela, if that's right. Yep. So we'd like to hear from you about if you think that there's any sort of perspectives that haven't been represented this afternoon, or points that you think should be made that haven't been made. And if you've got any sort of advice or suggestions for us for the social preference survey work that we're considering doing as part of the project, which might focus on particular types of examples, case study examples, or generic case study examples.
It's open to the wider audience, Diana?
Sorry, yeah, open to everybody, but I see Vicky.
I don't seem to have a digital way to raise my hand.
Oh,
so
sorry,
I
that's fine, yeah.
I think it would be interesting with some stakeholder groups, maybe not all, to try to ascertain if people are more comfortable talking about the physical, the ecosystem service flows and being told about how much carbon or flood protection, or if it's actually more effective to monetize those data. I think it'd be really interesting to get some sort of properly scientifically surveyed and information about that, what actually works with the stakeholders.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll listen to Ian's point now as well, and then maybe Michaela, you might like to say something before we move on.
Yeah, I think the two voices not particularly well represented today. Those people in the poorest areas who aren't going to benefit from this. Those people that live in very poor environments who aren't going to gain from any sort of net gain initiative. And the other side, and I'd be really keen to hear more from developers. I think there's a lot of developers out there that will be keen to work with groups like Sweep and all the other people here to try and implement this in a good way. I don't mean by my comments previous to sort of characterize developers as bad people. You know, developers have got to make a living as well, but we can't expect to actually produce guidelines for going forward if we don't engage with that most crucial community. Mm-hmm. So I would really encourage people to get in touch with us.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ian. I'm just noticing a couple of comments, Michaela, that you might like to be aware of as well about historic environment, cultural heritage. Is that being included?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and ask if there is any developer in the audience that would like to contribute with like the developer's perspective. Did we have anyone from the poll?
There was, but they might be, you know, they might be
shy,
keeping their powder dry, or they might have left or something.
Okay, well, no, in that case, I'll leave it. Is there any other question that we can pick up perhaps in the last couple of minutes that we have? Yeah, I've seen a comment on health and well-being and cultural heritage being considered as part of this. I guess this is still exploratory, right? So we are trying to figure out as well what should be the priorities for the project, considering that we cannot probably cover everything, absolutely everything at all scales and at all levels. So yeah, that is something that we would like more input on as well, if there is any strong views in one direction or the other. And yeah, I think both are really good points, because they are normally under considered aspects or benefits of the environment in general. So that is something we need to think about a bit more.
We're going to wrap up in like 1 or 2 minutes. The session's going to be finishing, and then we're going to be in a breakout room. If anybody would like to talk about anything further, are you very welcome. We're very keen to develop a wider stakeholder network and have a mailing list and send out queries, get some feedback, that sort of thing. So if anybody at all is interested, then please do get in touch with us. Either come on to the breakout group or drop Michaela or myself an email. We'd really like to hear from you. So Michaela, I think you've got like less than 1 minute to wrap up if you'd like to.
Yeah, so I think we sort of agree. I think we all agree based on the comments that I managed to read. I didn't go through all the comments in the chat because I didn't manage to do 2 things at the same time, but I've seen an overall agreement regarding the fact that considering environmental again in addition to biodiversity again is probably a good idea. There are, of course, there is still, of course, this question of the terrestrial being more considered or more prominent in general compared to the marine, but still it might be interesting to consider, I think, all sorts of development and all sorts of habitats, including the marine as well. That's my understanding, at least, of the discussion. In terms of scale, we didn't particularly touch on the local versus regional versus national scale. So that's probably something we can follow up separately. But I think there was an overall agreement that where we compensate or where we offset for development-driven environmental degradation matters. And we don't necessarily need to constrain ourselves to on-site or within the county level boundaries for this sort of projects. I think there was an overall agreement on that as well. The consideration of people, I think, is something we all agreed as well on. So we should be doing this not just for the environment, but also to bring benefits to people. And in particular, I think some participants and also the speakers mentioned the fact that we need to consider somehow also the less well-off in our society, because they will probably be benefiting less anyway from this sort of environmental improvements related to developments. In terms of the finance, I think I'm not entirely sure whether we got an agreement there. This seems to be a bit more of an open question still for the future, but it seemed to me that there are several potential streams that could be considered for financing this. And anyway, having the buy-in from the policymakers will be crucial to make this happen.
Yeah.
So I think that was probably the main messages. I don't know, I might have missed something really important, but I think that's my take-home message, at least from the discussion today.
I would just say I think there's some really good points coming in the chat, and
yes,
it would be a great idea. I don't know technically how we do it.
Just to confirm,
we're capturing the chat.
That we are capturing that. Yes, I mean this is
yes.
also recorded. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
we're capturing it. Yeah, sure, we're going to trawl through it. So yeah. So thank you very much, everybody. I think this has been hugely helpful. It's really, really interesting to have the comparison between the marine and the terrestrial, because there's such different sort of frames of reference for thinking about this, and they bounce off each other and raise new questions and influence each other. It's really terrific. So thank you ever so much, everybody. If anybody would like to join us in the breakout room from now on, you're very welcome, and really appreciate your contributions today and for just taking the time to sit in and join in. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
That was great.
Yeah, that
Thanks
was
to the speakers as well that we haven't thanked before.
Yes, sorry.
Anna and Vicky.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate your help.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. That's great.
I just want to thank everybody that took, well, actually the whole day, but this afternoon has just been fantastic right the way through. And just to let you know, I am getting all these emails from people just saying, wow, we knew Sweet was good, but we didn't know it was this good. So well done, everyone.
So I think that's a brilliant note to take these presentations and discussions to a close on. Thank you very much to everybody who's presented or been involved in the research and really importantly been involved in all of these discussions throughout the whole day and the whole afternoon. It's been really brilliant. Just be assured as well that everything is going to be available after the event. So if you look on our Sweep website, there should be all the resources and the presentations from the Expo will be available for anyone to go and have a look at. We hope you've enjoyed this session and the other sessions this afternoon. If you could spare a minute or 2 minutes, there is a very short evaluation form that we'd love to hear your opinions for and love to hear what you think, and if there's any perspectives for anything we've discussed today that you'd like us to try and include in the project going forwards. And what we're going to do now is we're going to open up a set of breakout rooms. So this is an opportunity for you to sort of continue the discussions and ask any questions for any of the presenters from this session. The way that this will work is when this talk finishes in a minute, so we'll close, there's going to be a breakout button which will appear at the bottom of your screen. You can use this to join the sort of Q&A session of your choice, and you can move between rooms as well. When you enter this room, can you make sure that your video is on, but just stay muted, just to make sure we reduce the background noise. When the breakout sessions end, there's no plenary session, so that will just be the end of this. So thank you very much from me as well. It's been really enjoyable. In case there's any technical difficulties, then if you can't see the breakout button at the bottom of your screen, just write in the chat, and there's a group of people who make sure you get automatically moved into the breakout session of your choice. So just write in the chat if you have any issues, and you should be able to move yourself between breakout rooms to engage with different groups. But yeah, the session will close when the breakouts do. So from me, thank you very much. I hope you've all had a great afternoon, and hope you have some great discussions in the breakout rooms. Thank you.